Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first virtual version of the Interchange in 2020. So, we're going to have a very interesting debate today with regards to the COVID-19 crisis. So, 31 December 2019, while we were all codifying our New Year's resolutions to the beautiful scenery of fireworks and the sound of DJ Zintle's Umlilo. I remember my biggest resolution was traveling. I was traveling with my wife. I wanted to go to Spain, Portugal, do the whole thing. I had budgets and everything, and then something hit us. The Rona hit us. And little did we know that in Wuhan, China, a novel coronavirus had been discovered and was quietly wreaking havoc in the small Chinese province. The Chinese government was telling the world that we must relax and it's not quite a crisis just yet. And the World Health Organization was also being very slow to force their hand on China. We didn't really see it coming. And by the time COVID was declared a pandemic, it was too late. It had spread all over the world, and soon it came to South Africa. We went into lockdown, and our economy suffered unbelievably. Small businesses closing, businesses retrenching, and poor people who cannot afford to social distance bore the brunt. The lockdown steadied the infection rate, but as we eased restrictions, infections shot up. Today, we're sitting at 124,590 cases. And the benefit is that the economy has jump-started and people are beginning to see steady flow of income and life is moving on, as it were, but it's coming at an incredible expense. But now that we have the benefit of hindsight, we are able to reflect on whether or not the lockdown was even a necessary means to curb the virus in the first instance. And conversations are happening all over the world as to what truly is the best way to curb the virus, what truly is the best way to curb the virus in such a way that reinforces economic activity and economic action. And as usual here on the Interchange, I have an incredible panel of debaters to debate these issues, these highly controversial issues, in a time that has completely changed the way that we live our lives across the world. I've got an incredible proposition, and I've got Eric Kazadi, who is an environmental science student whose hobbies include a disproportionate amount of debating and admiring Instagram aesthetics. Shout out to Eric. How are you doing?
Hi, everyone. I'm good. Glad to be here and happy to see your faces.
Awesome. We have his partner, Kolwani Dube, who's an educator by day and a debater by night, like a Batman. How are you doing, Kolwani?
I'm doing great, Tammy. It's fun to be back on the Interchange,
Right? And on opposition, we have Lindo Gutle Mabasu. And Lindo Gutle is a BA law student at WITS, a debater, and she is in the Amasi with Salt group. And greatest of all, she is a Black woman. Lindo Gutle, how are you doing?
Yeah, Phila, how are you, Tammy?
Awesome. Tumelo, we have Tumelo as her partner, and Tumelo is a politics student, a keen linguist, and an avid traveler, which, you can't really be an avid traveler no more now, can you, Tumelo?
Nah, I've been in my mama's house for like 3 months now, so yeah.
So ain't nobody traveling right now, man. Like, we travel on
Anybody going nowhere. You travel to chicken. You travel to eat food. That's where you go.
Big facts. And our expert is a very good friend of mine, my very best friend, my brother, Bongani Masilela. And, Bongani is incredible. He's really dope. And Bongani is an entrepreneur whose life purpose and work is linked to the development agenda of Africa, and in particular, the role of education, sustainable cities, communities, decent work, and economic growth, and how all of these play a role in aligning Africa with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. As a graduate of WITS University Development Studies Honors Program, which ranks number 19 in the world and focuses on economics, labor in the 21st century, and research and analytics, he has the formal educational background to be able to create real-world solutions for some of the most pressing issues in Africa. Bongs, man, how are you doing?
As well as we could be doing during this period. but I think I'm okay.
Hey, we just have to take what we can during this time, can we, man?
Exactly. You know, take up learning a new language or try coding or baking, and you'll get through it.
Because I'm your best friend, I actually know that you're doing all of those things. So it's not for the audience, eh? Like that's like life experience advice.
Exactly.
So today we're discussing the motion, this house regrets the lockdown. Very straightforward, very controversial. I think it's time for us to actually have this debate, and in a way that, has intellectual weight, as we always aspire towards here at the Interchange. But like, what are your like preliminary thoughts, not only on the motion, but like about the times we're going through? And I think particularly with regards to how it's affected the broader African economy, especially given your background?
I think what's interesting, every time I think of the successes and failures of our own government during the lockdown, as well as those of other governments around the world, I keep going back to that Bill Gates TED talk from 5 years ago, where he played out this scenario, which is now very practically playing out in the world, one in which a global pandemic could potentially be more destructive than any war that we've known in the modern day era, and how if we're prepared for grand scale wars, which aren't going to happen, likely not going to happen in the 21st century, but we're not as prepared for a global pandemic and a virus that could affect the whole world, then we're wasting our money, time, resources, and intelligence. And so I think this period has not only highlighted how grossly underprepared we were for an event that had a high probability of happening, but it's also shown that it's also gotten us to question who the most rational actors around the world are, who the most necessary actors in the world are. You know, our favorite Hollywood celebrities aren't superheroes, but nurses and doctors are the real superheroes. Teachers are the real superheroes because they've had to find innovative ways to make sure that children are still learning throughout this period. Cleaners, and janitors in corporate offices are clearly more necessary than some of the executives who drive in with expensive cars and have the best offices and so on. And so it's really gotten to question us. It's really gotten us to question the value that people contribute to society, as well as our preparedness for future events such as these. And I think South Africa has been a great example in many respects, has been a great example to the rest of the world. But there are many instances where we honestly could have done this lockdown a lot better, and we simply didn't. And there aren't any excuses for that. So those are my preliminary thoughts on the lockdown in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, incredible. I think it's wild because what people are also saying is that like the future has been accelerated. And I was just listening to like a venture, like I forgot his name. He's a venture capitalist, and he said something so interesting. He's like, if in your business, if you look at the better parts of your business model today or before the crisis, the most dominant parts of your business model, and you look at them post-crisis, what you're doing actually is you had an opportunity to see those parts of your business model, what they would look like 10 years from now. And if those parts of your business models are still intact, that means your business was going to survive. But if they've died, your business would have been gone by now. And that's just where we are right now, where everything is so contentious just because of the novelty of the crisis. But there have been so many predictions for this kind of thing happening, and we're just caught off guard. Look, let's just jump straight into the debate. Let's actually hear what the speakers themselves have to say. And the motion is, this house regrets the lockdown. So before we start the debate, the rules are as follows. So we're having a BP half debate where we're going to be having two speakers in a proposition who would propose the motion, who are for the motion, and we're having two speakers in opposition who are against the motion. Speakers have 4 minutes to speak, like a hard deadline of 4 minutes. And after 1 minute, I will indicate that 1 minute is up. After 3 minutes, I will indicate that 3 minutes is up. And at 4 minutes, I will stop you completely, very rudely so. And then afterwards, we're going to have a wonderful conversation about the actual debate itself. I believe we are ready to start. Are we ready to start, debaters?
Yeah.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Definitely
Eric,
ready.
we are ready for you. You may start from proposition speaker one. Let's go.
Just to be clear, our stance is not that there shouldn't have been a lockdown. We do think that there should have been some sort of regulation to help curb the spread and to help save lives. What we specifically think, though, is that the South African government is guilty for gross mismanagement of the pandemic, but also is guilty of using this as an opportunity to implement very draconian, unconstitutional laws that they otherwise wouldn't have. What do we think is realistically the problem? The first is we think there's been a gross lack of miscommunication or a gross lack of communication from government officials. This looks like the president not giving daily briefings, as we've seen other presidents do in other countries, just to update individuals on the situation. The second thing is that we don't think there was a consultative process before the lockdown was implemented. We think it's important when requiring individuals to give up certain freedoms that you ask them what freedoms they are willing to trade off and exactly to which extent. We don't think that existed, especially because it's enshrined in crisis and pandemic control legislation that already exists. So we think that already from the setup of this lockdown, there was a lot of issues with it. But the second and perhaps most important thing is the very disproportionate economic impact that it has on vulnerable individuals already. We see this both during the pandemic and post the pandemic. The first is that the COVID-19 relief fund has literally not paid out anyone that I personally know of who actually needs the money. But secondly, it has been plagued with money laundering, with individuals swindling the funds. Just the other day, I read about someone who diverted 26 million rands to their own personal pocket from that fund. We think the mismanagement of this has made vulnerable communities that much more vulnerable. But secondly, post the pandemic, we've just reported a 1% increase of our already high unemployment rate. This means that already individuals who are part-time laborers, individuals with limited job security, are now being disproportionately affected again. This is really impactful because things such as taxis, with their primary mode of transportation, has also risen. That means that individuals who were not working, even as we start relaxing regulations, can't get to work as feasibly as they would have, and also just to have limited economic prospects in order to make their lives comfortable. We think the impacts of this, both during and post the pandemic, are extremely devastating. But lastly, we think that the state has acted in a way that is unconstitutional. There's been numerous court court cases being raised against the state. What we've had is ministers such as Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma or the Minister of Education just delaying the court process, not appearing to court date and not cooperating in that process. This means that they're passing very draconian laws, such as the ban on cigarettes, which yes, there is some harm, but that clearly isn't the most important thing in this current crisis. So it seems like there's a misprioritization of government's priorities. They aren't acting within the provisions of the law. But also, lastly, even the extension of the lockdown itself is problematic, because when it was initially introduced, it was something that had political backing from across the spectrum. All opposition parties backed it. Everyone was supportive of it and thought Cyril was leading us from the front. What we have now, though, is a very confusing 5-tiered, well, now it's 6-tiered because we are on advanced stage 3 system, that no one really knows what is going on, what are the differences of regulations, and the briefings and things like that, which are already characterized as being very inconsistent, don't provide much clarity. We think then that the government needs to do what the government has. In retrospect, we think that the government has failed the people because they have made the vulnerable communities that much more vulnerable. But secondly, they have done it in a manner which is unconstitutional and not properly communicated. And for these reasons, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Eric. Right on time. The games have begun. Let's welcome Lindo Guhle to start the opposition case. Here.
Yeah. I think the first thing to note about Eric's case is that they don't necessarily regret the lockdown, but they make an important point and a very true point on how it could have been better. We also concede to this. However, this does not necessarily justify regretting the extent of, or rather the entire lockdown completely. With that in mind, a couple of things that he says. So the first thing is that their stance is that the government should have at least consulted the public on which freedoms they're willing to forgo, as opposed to the strict and the very stringent lockdown that is currently implemented. I think what's important to note is that in times of crisis, be it war, be it a global pandemic, especially one like COVID that has never been seen before, the government doesn't exactly have a thing that, not a thing, but like a process that they can measure their actions to. And it's all just figuring it out as we go. And so in this instance, it is very inevitable that rights and freedoms will be limited, and sometimes without the consult of the public. What is important is that we can hold the government accountable for whether or not their actions do in fact bring about the outcome that is desired, i.e. our protection, right? The third thing I'm going to address is on like economic concerns and mismanagement. Dumela will deal more with this, but I'll also show you in my positive matter why this brought about an important nuance in how the government operates. On the extent of the lockdown itself, we think it seems very rational that the government would not open all sectors at the same time. So in terms of what I'm specifically going to talk about, firstly, we need to establish a criteria, right? We should regret the lockdown on the grounds that, one, it is inefficient in achieving its aims, and secondly, that it has caused more harm than good. I'm going to directly deal with the first pillar on this. So firstly, it's important to note what the actual purpose of the lockdown was, right? One, most importantly, what it wasn't, which is that it's not supposed to eradicate the problem completely. But what it was is an effort to mitigate the spread, thus not growing the number of people who would demand assistance from the healthcare, to suppress the virus from going quicker, and to protect people who are most vulnerable. So with that in mind, the first argument is that the lockdown was specifically important to curb the spread, especially in comparison to the government's initial response, which was rather less stringent. The reason I say this is that the government's initial response was largely based on suppressing paranoia, which meant people were still allowed to go to work, to go to school, even if they confirmed that we had cases, right, at the beginning. This was a bit of a problem because it meant at this point, we weren't exactly curbing the spread, but at best, the government was just suppressing paranoia. On top of that, information on the virus was not widely communicated, and importantly, it was also not standard. So people weren't exactly clear, or rather all informed the same on what the impact as well as the nature of the virus was. So a lockdown was important, one, to communicate the critical nature of having this virus in the country, and secondly, to standardize knowledge on how everyone should respond and act. The third thing is that South Africa's demographic includes a lot of people who firstly suffer from immune suppressing illnesses such as TB as well as AIDS. And so, but on top of that, we also have a lot of individuals who are necessarily, who are in like the middle to lower class bracket. It was therefore important for the government to act in a protective way because of the nature of our demographic. So we have a demographic that is largely at risk, especially should this virus spread. And very, very lastly, things like the pressure to go to work and people not having sufficient funds and all of that meant that there was a specific demand for government assistance. What we saw was the emergence of what I'd call socialist policies, where the government would give funds and grants to people who otherwise would not have gotten them previously. The government gave funds to businesses to continue to operate. And so we saw a state that emerged specifically with more or less socialist policies that aimed at helping society to continue to progress, even if
your time is up. Hopefully, Tumelo will continue your case. All right, let's move on to the second speaker from side proposition. Kolwani, got you, man. Let's get it.
All right, the most important thing that we need to know about this debate is that it's about regretting. And then whenever we speak about regretting something, we need to look at it contextually. And contextually speaking, regret the way in which South Africa dealt with the coronavirus and the lockdown that it implemented. Please note that most of opposition's case is on a generalized what preventing what a lockdown should have looked like. We are here to tell you as proposition today that the way that the lockdown actually played out is a way in which we in the way that the government implemented it. And this is where we need them to engage today. So two things in terms of determining like where this debate is actually going. To analyze and look at the reasons that we actually had and implemented the lockdown. Remember, the lockdown was implemented for the sake of preserving human life and for human survival. Therefore, the criteria for it is that we couldn't not have sacrificed people's livelihoods and people's ways of living that would actually have helped them
1 minute up.
stay and stay afloat economically and in terms of how they would stay and survive within South Africa, right? That's most important. It wouldn't have mattered if we had stopping a pandemic if it meant that people don't have food on their table, which is exactly what happened in this context of South Africa, because it meant most of Eric's analysis on how when we actually were supposed to be given or were actually supposed to be giving out as the SA state and the governance, things like the COVID relief fund in the country still have not received this. The reason that the taxi industry is even having itself saying that it's going back to 100% capacity as of today is because of the ideas that they know that they cannot sustain themselves and sustain their livelihood. Individuals on the ground regret what lockdown has done because it has individuals are not getting fed. The government came out and made plenty of promises that it didn't live up to. And this is important in response to what Lindo speaks about when she speaks about the policies that we. What's the point of those policies existing if those policies never had a payout? What's the point of saying that Montero was willing to give the education system more classrooms, accessibility to sanitation and water, but in current status quo that doesn't exist, but people were still pushed back into existence? It therefore defeats the purpose of that lockdown, because the basis of the lockdown and its implementation was that the government said it would do those things. In the instance that the government fails to do the things that it does say it was going to do for the empowerment of people, it removes the legitimacy of implementing that lockdown in the first place. We need them to engage on how the government has failed with the policies that they use with the reasons of why lockdown should not be a thing. The last important thing that I think we need to know is about how the entire lockdown played out, right? And when we speak about the chat of regretting it, we look at it in two ways. Firstly, how the lockdown existed in the way that it did in its early stages, but secondly, how it existed post-lockdown. We're not even at the post-lockdown stage. There's still industries that are cut off and they're still harming people. The extended time that the lockdown existed, especially with the spikes in numbers we had 6th of June, the most recorded cases, means that the lockdown has lost its effect, but it is still within effect in our country and in its economy. It's providing more harm, and in even today's society, we still regret it right now. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Koloni. Thank you very much for that speech. Let's move on to the last speaker of the debate to close it off for us. Tumelo Bure, let's go.
So I think it's important for us as a point of departure to kind of truly grapple with what and the severity of everything that Lindo tells us, right? When she gives us a criteria for when we regret something and when it's important for us to regret something. We're not speaking about this in general terms, right? And I think what they try and do is that they opt out of this debate and they try and kind of only speak about, and it's this point that Eric brings about, that the COVID relief fund is ineffective because people he personally knows haven't gotten the money. And I think that's a very weird and arbitrary line in the sand to draw when it comes to issues of the COVID relief fund, right? And I think that's particularly important. So let's talk about this argument that they talk about when they talk about the livelihood of like everyday South Africans being affected. And in doing so, I'm going to do two things, right? And I think we've all kind of misconstrued, or I think proposition rather has misconstrued the intention and the purpose of the lockdown and what it actually meant to do. So I'm going to add on to what Lindo says, right? So what Lindo tells you is that the lockdown was meant to mitigate the spread of the virus. But moreover, right, and this is where we point to the successes of the lockdown within the South African context, because they want us to engage in them on a contextual basis, right? Yeah, right. What the lockdown allowed for people to do, right, is that what the government to do, right, is it allows for the government to then prepare the healthcare facilities. This is to say, right, initially, like before we even instituted a lockdown, there was in essence shortcomings with equipment and PPE for people, right? So what the lockdown then does is that it slows down the spread of the virus, so that at the time at which the peak does come, the government is then far more well equipped to in essence deal with that peak. We think this is particularly important when it comes to the context that Lindo gives you when she tells you about how the South African population is comprised of people who have who are in essence immunocompromised, people who suffer from HIV and AIDS and underlying conditions. These people then need in essence access to these healthcare facilities. Because what we've seen then across the world, right, is what happens when healthcare facilities are overwhelmed. We've seen the examples of Italy, Spain, and currently now of the US and the US and Brazil, when healthcare services are overwhelmed, people do not have access to to healthcare, and they are more likely to die because of that. And we think this is in essence a benefit of the lockdown, and we think that's particularly important. But let's focus on the economic argument, right? And I think in this argument we talk about the inevitability of a lockdown. So in this instance, we're going to use two examples, right? We're going to use New Zealand and the USA, right?
Sure.
Countries that have also New Zealand, in essence, what happened is, as soon as they had the coronavirus, they instituted a strict lockdown and waited 3 weeks until they had a new case before they could leave the country of the lockdown. What happens then is that they saw another spike in cases after the lockdown, right? And we think the US, what that example shows you is that even at the point at which the lockdown is perfect, there was inevitably going to be a rise in cases. So that, in essence, says that the lockdown was going to happen in and of itself. But the worst case scenario that exists on the other side of the spectrum is the US, right? What oftentimes happens when countries or states, in essence, open way too early is the fact that the cases are then far worse than they were initially, right? And we think that's particularly important. So what then we've shown you then, in essence, in our position, is that the criteria to regret the lockdown hasn't been met by proposition. And even though the lockdown has been a blunt instrument to the sophisticated problem that is COVID-19, we think that it has been comparatively better than people losing their lives because of this and government inefficiency when it comes to handling this virus. We think we've shown you not only in the intention of the lockdown and how there have been successes to the lockdown, and how even if these economic harms are not exclusive to the lockdown and were existing on a global pandemic, and we think that's what we give you in opposition, and that's why we win the debate.
Thank you very much, Dumela. Thank you very much for closing that debate on that resounding note. Bongani, what are your preliminary thoughts of this debate? It sounded to me like a nice battle between intentions and outcomes.
So really quite a stellar debate. I especially enjoyed the fact that this debate focused on a very contextual metric of whether the government's response has worked. Because I think with debates like this, it's obviously very easy to fall into the trap of just criticizing the South African government just in general, maybe because you don't like them or whatever. So the contextualization was narrow enough for there to be a true point of contention in today's debate. And so I think two things really stood out in this debate. The first one has to do with the way that the government related to everyday South Africans. So this idea that everyday South Africans get to relate with the Constitution, but that relationship has been compromised. The fact that the president wasn't doing daily briefings and all of those things. And then there's also the idea of the very poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable in South Africa and how they've benefited or have been harmed by this lockdown. So those two things really, really stood out in today's debate. And I'm glad that both teams were able to give us very strong content on that. The comparison between international countries, which was brought up by Dumelo, examples, the US and New Zealand, also gives us quite a strong benchmark to place South Africa in the middle of that, right? A country that didn't implement a lockdown early enough and one that implemented a very, very strict lockdown. Again, that helps us place this debate contextually very nicely into how poor people were affected, small businesses were affected, and how the healthcare system ended up being overwhelmed or not overwhelmed. So quite a strong debate today. And I'll just wait on word for you to give the final feedback and results.
Cool. I mean, I just want to hear from, I want us to get into the discussion now. And from a proposition point of view, Eric, what I really, really want to hear and understand is what do you think that we could have done better during this crisis as the South African government? Because from the proposition case is very compelling in the sense that there might have been general failure, but how could we have achieved the balance between healthy economic activity and flattening the curve, as it were?
Yeah. So I think that's a very important question. I think the first is better government planning. I think it's problematic that we only had an adjusted finance, national budget come 2 weeks ago, last week. So that already shows a level of unpreparedness. Secondly, I think the priority was overwhelmingly on bailing out businesses and supporting businesses as opposed to supporting actual individuals within the country, right? So there is a lot of talk with banks and getting banks ready, but the individuals who are the backbone of the economy were left destitute. So I think that the government really needed to do a stronger support base for the actual individuals. Like the example Chimendo speaks of in terms of New Zealand, for example, I think you can trade off strict human rights limitations on human rights and rights in general and libertarian values only if the outcomes of that are actually beneficial, right? So China, New Zealand, South Korea, countries that had very strict and draconian policies, we saw the outcomes of that was that individuals were not left hungry or destitute. There was a good safety net provided by the government. That's not the case in South Africa. So South Africa wants to have its cake and eat it too. Strict regulations without actually supporting individuals. That I think is the major problem.
But here's my chat, Eric. And this is probably a question to both you and Kolani as well. In comparison to New Zealand, and all the other countries that you'd mentioned, including China, we just not as rich as they are. So the ability for our state to support individuals the way in which those states have promised and have actually supported individuals, the US releasing $1 trillion fund to give people individually in their homes, is definitely impossible from our side. So do you think that within the confines and limitations of our own economy, there was still something we could have done better in that regard? Maybe Kolani can answer this one.
So Tammy, I think that's very interesting because I think what we need to note is that we're not saying that the government should have done more than what it had promised.
Sure.
I'm saying that when the president in his addresses, the 3 or 4 addresses that he did, there were certain promises and there were certain funds that were said were available, right? And this is the point of contention that we just have, that at the point that those certain funds were said to be available, we're now questioning the efficiency of how those funds were used. Because I think it was important to note that we're not saying that we could have done what New Zealand could have done. We couldn't have taken out maybe trillions of dollars like the US did. But what happened to those billions that the president said were going to be released? What happened to those funds? And that's our question as proposition in this debate in the efficiency of that lockdown, because it's what was promised, was it delivered? And I think that's just the question on the matter in the efficiency of the implementation, because we don't think that South Africa should have could have actually done more than that, but what they said that we don't think that they actually delivered.
That's a very strong point. And back to the opposition this side, it seems like the South African government has been exposed for its inefficiencies because, it's one thing to be inefficient in general, but it's another thing to be chronically inefficient during crisis. Is there anything we could have done better from our side, or are we actually fulfilling our promises, the promises that were given to us from a government point of view, Lindo?
So what I think, and I concede very much to what you're saying, and I think it ties to the argument on socialist policies that firstly, during the pandemic, the government realized the importance of that response, a response that wouldn't be contingent on working in order for you to get a pay, but simply to just get payment because you can't afford to work anymore. And so the government realized the importance of that. But on top of that, what the pandemic also did was to expose the previous inefficiencies of the government and how those are playing out even worse now. And so I think what we could have done better, number one, is to have been far more efficient in the past, which sounds a bit ridiculous, but the literal point to it is if people had houses that would enable them to stay at home safely, if people had work, which means they have access to unemployment funds that they could cash from, then they wouldn't be so hungry that they're willing to sacrifice staying at home in order for them to get food. So literally, it's just being efficient and having done what we should have done in the past first. Yeah,
that's a very, very good point. And it just, this analysis is in parallel to what's happening in the US from a commentator's point of view, where they're like, Bernie should have won the Democratic nomination because, all of the policies that he's advocating for could have been policies that would have given Americans the safety net during times such as these, meaning that the true policy and governmental winners are those that in the first instance were efficient and were good. But it sounds like, Tumelo, we had extremely good intentions walking into this one. Is there hope that we will achieve a situation where we flatten the curve while still retaining a sense of economic productivity without enduring the cost of people's lives?
To be brutally honest, no.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a very hard answer to have, but like it doesn't sound cheery. But realistically, if you look at countries that, like, let's look at the EU, for instance, right? The EU had 2 bills, right, proposed for COVID relief funds, like a COVID relief fund. And both of those bills are possibly some of the biggest bills to come out of the EU. Like, it's almost like €1 billion. I think like the global markets across the board are taking a hit. So I think the one example that people use when they want to try and justify why we shouldn't have a lockdown is Sweden, right? Because Sweden didn't have a lockdown.
Yes.
So Sweden is an inherent welfare state. Yeah, they have free healthcare for everyone. And here's the comparison: even without the lockdown, their GDP is set to shrink at 7%. And whilst that's comparatively better than like the US's economy proposed to shrink at 30%, like the global economy has been shaken, and it's going to be shaken for the foreseeable year or like the next year and a half, because realistically, without a vaccine, this is going to be everyday life, and there is going to be there's going to be a toll paid, in a sense, people choosing their lives, and I don't think the economy is going to restart in the way in which it has restarted before. But what I do think this provides is an avenue upon which we can rethink the way economies are structured globally, right? Whether or not we need people to do like blue collar work and that type of stuff, and how we can reorientate the workplace to be different from what we know it to be now. Because what we've seen now is how capitalism, or like the already existing economic order, has failed us and has put more people in danger than it has equipped them to be safe. And I think that's something we can look forward to. However, to say that like there's not going to be a loss of life is, I think, a bit naive and not in essence a realistic view of the world.
That's a very, very strong point. And, it really leads very nicely into the point that I want Bongani to make in conclusion. Bongani, I mean, there've been many ways we've been looking at this crisis, right? We've been, looking at it from the lens of fear, and anxiety, where we look at the amount of lives we're losing. We're looking at the amount of livelihoods we are losing as well because of the lockdowns and all those kinds of things. But simultaneously, there is an option, and I guess if you also in the frame of mind to even take that option, to look at it from a positive point of view in terms of what it has done to demonstrate what the future economy is going to look like and what opportunities it presents specifically for developing countries and in particular for Africa itself. So maybe from your perspective, from just maybe I'd like to appeal to your idealistic lens. Paint us a picture for the opportunity for Africa post-corona here.
So I think there are 2 points of discussion here, right? I'll cover your question more in the second one, but the first one also speaks to it. The first point is that coronavirus, and I saw this on my Facebook timeline, one of my friends had mentioned, exposed the 2 different South Africas that we live in, which is an idea that President Thabo Mbeki had spoken about in the 2000s, right? There's the rich South Africa and the poor South Africa, which he also made synonymous with race. The rich South Africa looks at the government's response and thinks, brilliant, world-class, exemplary, because that South Africa is the one whose kids' education hasn't been disrupted because of online infrastructure. That is the South Africa that has experienced 0 police brutality. Suburbs haven't seen any SANDF soldiers at all, and they've barely seen any police presence in their neighborhoods. And so that South Africa is the one that is susceptible to Ramaphoria, basically, the idea that they buy into the president's word and his ideologies. the business community in South Africa has also jumped on the bandwagon and has collaborated with the president to a level that we haven't seen South African businesses cooperating with the government in about maybe 13 years. So that South Africa has really enjoyed the lockdown and enjoys being able to compare South Africa to the rest of the world. But the poor South Africa, as I said, is one without online infrastructure, that experiences police brutality, and that really doesn't understand what the president's strategy is about. As for forward-looking strategies, I think this is where South Africa has failed quite a bit, in a sense that we haven't had the strategic foresight to look at the opportunities that could come from refreshing South Africa going forward. So, for example, very little new policies about how we're going to implement more educational infrastructure in our schools going forward. We've been very reactive to the coronavirus, but we haven't been proactive at all. Secondly, healthcare. I think this was a great opportunity for the government to really flesh out what the national health insurance plan would actually look like. And if ever the majority of South Africans were going to buy into NHI, now is the time for the government to say, we're going to start piloting NHI, especially in communities where hospital infrastructure isn't that strong. How are we going to get private hospitals to start admitting people without medical aid, and how are we going to pilot the NHI? Secondly, global dynamics are changing, right? We're living in an era where the world's two largest superpowers have shown that they too are susceptible to things like global pandemics and economic downturns, and that the idea that they're the most rational actors in the global order has now been brought into question. So Africa needs to start rethinking the global economic order. Africa needs to start speeding up the Africa Free Trade Agreement to make sure that we're more reliant on each other and not necessarily some of the more powerful developed countries that we've relied on in the past. Crime, right? I'm nearly done. But crime was a big thing where during the lockdown, the crime rate in South Africa went down dramatically. And in fact, South Africa was the only country in the world to experience a negative death rate during the lockdown, in a sense that we experienced less deaths than any other country in the world, mainly because most people in South Africa die of crime-related activities. And so we had an opportunity to make sure that when the lockdown ends, the police system in South Africa is able to absorb any new criminal activity that comes after that. We could have beefed up our security infrastructure to make sure that when the country starts going back to normal, we can absorb that crime wave. And we didn't. And then finally, industrialization. Opportunity to industrialize South Africa quickly enough. We still relied on importing masks and PPE equipment, whereas we could have taken that opportunity to build those things locally and start providing more jobs locally. And as Lindo mentioned, housing, I think this is another big one where normal poor South Africans just weren't able to adhere to social distancing rules, because even the idea of property ownership in South Africa is up for ownership, is up for question. And we simply didn't deal with any of those things. So from a strategic point of view, I'm really concerned with the fact that South Africa didn't treat this as an opportunity to rethink everything and to usher in a new era of South Africa that is pro-poor, a new era of South Africa with 21st century policies that can really benefit the majority of the population in an equitable manner. And I hope that other countries, it looks like Nigeria has jumped on this opportunity, because the level at which they're adopting technological solutions is insane. Kenya as well has been very quick to respond to the educational deficiencies that come from not having technological infrastructure. And South Africa can only sit back and learn from those countries and figure out how we're going to catch up to Kenya and Nigeria over the next couple of years, because we simply didn't take the opportunities when they were there.
Sure. Very, very powerful closing from you, Bongani, there. I mean, from my side, I think I'd like to say that I think during a time such as this, you need two kinds of president. You need one president that is a leader in crisis. You need the kind of president that can lead a country through a war, through an abnormal time of emergency. That's what you need. A president that can calm our anxieties and can mitigate all kinds of harm, whether economic, whether health, whether crime, in any aspect. But you need a second kind of president, a president that is forward-looking in their developmental approach. Because at some point, the crisis, the war is going to come to an end, and it will not become the normal way of life but what's going to become the way of life is what's post-crisis and what's post-war. And that has to be a positively opportunistic leader. And, like you say, I totally agree with you. We haven't seen those kind of demonstrations from a South African standpoint where we are now, looking beyond having our anxieties quelled, but we're looking into what the state of our nation is going to look beyond this, and what the state of our future is going to look like beyond this. And truly the question about our youth boom on the African continent, it being turned and converted into an asset as opposed to liability. Guys, that was our first edition of the virtual interchange. It was an incredible debate that we had on this side with all the debaters. Debaters, thank you so much for being here.
It's been a pleasure, Tammy. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for availing yourself and availing your mind for this one.
Thank you for your time and the invitation.
Until next time, we will hear from you soon, guys. Thank you very much.